Well, in our last episode, we talked about 6 overrated church planting tactics. Today, we're going to go on the flip side and talk to you about 6 underrated church planting tactics for you and your team.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and sitting next to me is Dylan Dotson. And today we're going to give you the opposite of what we gave you last week, and we're going to give you 6 underrated church planting tactics.
That's right. Last week, we're overweighted, things that are not necessarily bad, but not as helpful as you think.
Yep.
These 6 are the underrated ones that you should do and actually focus on to actually grow your team, make a difference, raise money, and just get people excited about what's happening. Now, this one will say, again, this is more so focused on people who are getting ready to launch or hoping to launch, but some of these have principles that also exist for existing churches, so it still might be helpful for you. And again, like we said last time, if you go to practicalplanting.com/launch, you can get our launch team course. We actually talk about some of these things in a lot more detail of how to actually make this stuff happen. And so if you want more, check that out.
Yep.
Practicalplanting.com/launch. So these are underrated church planting tactics that church planters can not focus on as much as they should, and even though they are a lot more important than some of the things that we talked about last week that we do focus on.
Yep.
So here we go. Number 1 is a defined timeline. This is one of the biggest, most helpful things you can do when it comes to raising money, when it comes to inviting people on your launch team. This ambiguous, we think we're going to launch here at this time, we're not quite sure. People, if they don't know what they're saying yes to or committing to, it's really hard for them to say yes. And what you might find, what we found is that once we launched, we had some people who came on Sunday, once we actually launched, who have been here ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the pre-launch stuff, I was just confused on in the beginning, and so they're like, "What's happening? I think we're just going to wait." And so, define means like, what's like your 9 month? If you're 9 months out, for example, what do the next 9 months look like? Like, if you're meeting with me and you're asking me to join your team, like, can you tell me what I'm saying yes to? Like, how often are you meeting? What's it going to look like? Where are the gatherings? Where is the church plant going to be? Even if you don't have a space yet, like, where in this town?
Yeah.
It needs to be as focused as possible so that I can know where this is going to be. Ideally, your launch team meetings, whether they're where you live or somewhere else, are going to be close to the area you actually launch, so that people in their minds aren't used to driving one place and then having to go somewhere else. But breaking it down, making it really easy for me to know, and then having like a launch date is really important. It's much better to have like a hard launch date, and then maybe when you get a month or 2 or 3 out from that time, if you need to move it by a few weeks, that's totally fine because people are committed. But if you're like, hey, even if you've got like people on board and you're excited and if you've got wisdom and you've got experience, like if you can't tell me when this is actually launching, it's just really hard for me to get excited about what's going on. And if I was someone working a normal job and I wanted to join your team, like if you don't know when you're starting, then like it's going to be hard for me to say yes to. So define, not just generally speaking, in 3 months we're going to be here, in 3 months we think we're going to be here, but actually work through from your launch day backwards to come up with a schedule so that I know what I'm committing to if you ask me to join.
I think it would be far less detrimental to you or in other people's eyes to have a defined timeline and have to change it than to not have a defined timeline in the first place. Like, I get places, everyone has an issue with space, finding a space or locking down a space, whatever. But give a defined timeline, and if the space falls through, that's happened to many people, and you have to move it, or you can't find a space and you have to push it back a month or 2. I think people will totally understand because they've seen that you're actually thinking this through and something didn't work out as planned. But if you're just like, we're gonna plan to launch in this season, we're still looking for a space, so hopefully that'll work out. Or if not, then maybe we'll look at this time next year. Whatever. If everything's kind of left more ambiguous, it's way harder for people to get on board because it seems like you haven't thought it through. Even if you completely have thought through everything and you're just afraid to give a concrete timeline, being kind of wishy-washy about it makes it seem like you haven't really thought this through. Maybe you're unsure of some of these things. And so if you're unsure, then I'm super unsure.
Yeah. And the hard thing about timelines is you're not sure if it's going to work out this way or not. But if you don't have a goal to actually shoot for and work for, then then how are you even going to hit what you're even unsure about?
Yeah.
And so I'm just saying, if I were to meet with somebody and they were to say, not like arrogantly, like this is going to happen the way that I'm saying, but here's our plan, here's what we're looking to do, and actually could walk me through, here's when we're going to start meeting as a team. Here's the area. Here's our launch date. It's like, oh, you've thought this through. It might not happen exactly as you're saying, but you've done all you can to prepare, which means you are much more likely to hit your goals and just saying, I hope whenever this works out, it's gonna happen.
Yep, and people understand that life and things happen, whether it comes to playing a church or starting a business or doing a whatever thing that you have planned. I don't think anyone's gonna like hold your feet to the fire that you have to do the exact timeline or the exact date that you said that you would, because people get that life happens and things happen and things don't always work out the way that we plan. And so give as concrete of a timeline as you can, and just communicate well to your people what's going on. If you have a launch team and you have a space or an area you're trying to get and that space falls through, or for whatever reason things have to be pushed back, if you're communicating to them what's going on, then it's not going to come across as a shock. And I don't think you're going to get many people that are really going to push back on that. But if you're not really communicating to them, but just having to keep pushing it back, but not really telling them the reason or giving kind of any further dates, I think it's going to be a lot harder for people to commit.
Yeah, and speaking of defined timelines, we talked about last week the overration. I like that word.
Nice.
Of a prospectus. Like you can't put a defined timeline on a prospectus. You can put generalities, but it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
So working through a timeline, having something to present, even if it's not going to go exactly the way that you want, if you're having something that you're working through, you can adjust as you're doing it. And so a defined timeline is one of the most underrated church planting tactics to raise support and to get people on your team because they know what they're actually committing to.
Yep.
Number 2, talk about why you want to plant this church. So don't give us numbers, don't give us statistics, just your desires. Again, last episode we talked about, this pressure we put on ourselves, why another church, and we feel like we have to justify it with all these numbers and statistics about how this needs to happen and why now. And even though, once you plant the church, you can put these heavy expectations on yourself because you're not going to radically change the percentage of people that go to church in your city and all these sort of things.
Yeah.
It's a lot more exciting for me, whether I'm a church going to support you or someone to join your team, if you're passionate and excited, and I know you are, but passion and excitement does not come through in numbers. It comes through in like, man, I really love this community, or man, I grew up here, or man, this thing happened to me here, or whatever it is, there is a reason, I'm hoping, beyond just numbers, why you are where you are.
Yeah.
And communicating that will get people on board and get people excited. It doesn't matter if you're in a church, if you're in a town with a lot of churches that, seem to be doing really well, because as we know, simply saying if everyone wanted to show up on church on a Sunday, they wouldn't have room. Like, there you go. There's another reason.
Yep.
So there's lots of reasons, right. But why do you want to do this? I think ministry, we can over spiritualize it, and I'm not saying this is everyone's story. My story, there's reasons why I'm in ministry, which wasn't what I thought I was going to do growing up. But one of the reasons I do what I do, and we're in America, so we get to do this, just to be honest, is because I want to. And it's not just because I wanted to. I think there's other reasons why this happened. But if I hated it, you don't have to be in ministry. That's not, God doesn't need you. You're not going to be the one that saves the world. And so if you can just tell me, hey man, I love this area. I want to make a difference in this community, whatever those are. I'm being general because I'm not you. But what is it for you? That's a reason to be there. And so why do you want to be there? Don't give me numbers. Why plant this church? That'll go further than you think it will.
Well, just giving numbers doesn't tell the complete story. Like, why are you planting a church here? Because there are X number of unchurched people. Does that mean that I should also plant a church here? But why do you want to plant a church here? If it's just based on numbers, then what you're saying is that anyone should plant a church, which maybe a lot more people should, but it doesn't tell me the reason of why specifically you want to plant a church here, because there's more to it than that. And it's okay that there's more to it than that. We don't need to pretend like human emotion isn't involved, or our upbringing or whatever doesn't play into it at all. But communicate why you want to plant a church, because if it's just that this is an unreached place, no matter where you are, there's more unchurched people in some other city. So that's not the only reason that you're planting one here.
Yeah.
And so just be honest about it. And that honesty can be, I love this city and I really want to plant a church here. And if someone told me that, I'd be like, God, cool.
What are you going to say to that? That's a terrible idea.
Right. And I'd be like, dude, because you're being honest. I'm more on board with this than if you were to tell me all the reasons why this city needs another church, because you're telling the truth, and that's good. And that's what we need. And so just be honest about the reasons you're planting. And I guess think through it first, think through it beforehand. Obviously, hopefully you're not caught off guard by that question. But bring your own human emotion into it. I think that's what people want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, even things like every time I drive down this block or go down this street or look at this building, or I see the brokenness here, I would love for God to allow me to play a small part in bringing hope to these people. Mm-hmm. I think, again, part of the problem is we think people are looking for answers that they're not. Yeah. And so we have to come up with all of these reasons. But again, if someone said, man, I just really love this community and I really love these people, and I really love my friends here or my kids' friends or their parents or whatever, nobody's going to be like, well, that's dumb. Like people are going to say, especially pastors in terms of like raising support, they're going to be like, oh, they're not here because it's a cool place to be.
Yeah.
Or they're not here because they have some martyr complex and like they want to be successful where other churches don't seem to fail. It's like they want God to use them here. And that humility goes a long way. And so talking about why you want to plant this church without numbers is a legitimate answer. So don't think don't think otherwise.
Yeah. And one thing to think through, this is not a type of church planting I have much experience with, but I know some people do it. If you're going, parachute planting, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Like if you're going to an area that you're not from to plant a church, I think this is like really something that you need to think through because it's just a lot less obvious of an answer. And I don't know what that answer is for you, obviously. But if you're going somewhere new to plant a church or somewhere where you don't have a ton of experience in, not saying it can't happen, but I think this is definitely something you need to have an answer to and a good answer to.
If you're parachute planting into a place and then someone asks you why, and then you tell them all statistics about why their city is messed up, that's just not going to work well. And so now that might be part of the reason why you came, but that can't just be the only reason. So tell people why. Your desires, not numbers. Number 3, tell a story of what God is doing. And so, again, if you're not a big church, which you won't be, you're a plant, you don't have tons of money, it might be discouraging to hear other churches and all their baptisms and all the cool things that are happening. But even a single story of what God is doing is not one of it. It's the best thing that you can share. And you can share it many times. Like, there doesn't have to be especially as you're meeting with other people, it doesn't have to be this radical thing. Like people, like we said last episode, I know I'm butchering it, but like 1 million is a statistic and 1 is a number or tragedy if something bad happens. But like that's a story. And so, if you don't have a lot going on, but you have someone that's been coming to your gatherings who is an atheist or grew up as another faith but has questions and like has been coming and has been enjoying the community, like that's really, really cool to hear. It's a mistake to assume that everybody wants to hear big numbers and big cool things that are happening. People want to hear things that they can relate to. And so whether you're sharing with a person, inviting someone on your team, a pastor or a ministry leader about getting support, come prepared to share a story or two. And you don't need 50. I mean, 1 or 2 would be really awesome. A face and a name of what God is doing. Again, it shows that you actually care, that he's actually doing something. And they don't have to be like this radical, I was drug addicted and all these things, and then I got baptized, and now I'm amazing. But just like small things of faithfulness go a long way. So telling a story is one of the best things that you can do.
And if you're super early in the process, just gathering a launch team, you might be thinking, I don't have a story yet. Like nothing, we're still starting. Like, how do I tell a story? There's a lot of places you can pull, like if you did a residency somewhere, a story that you were involved in there, not necessarily like they baptized so many people last year and so now I want to plant a church, but like an actual story of a human whose life was changed. And like I said, it doesn't have to be this drastic thing, but just someone who you can actually like put a name to the story and tell a story of what happened there, or something in your own life that you've seen of someone's life changing or turning around and that you want to be a part of that happening more in more people's lives, or your own life. Like if you had a story that led to the reason why you want to plant a church, that connects way better, like we've talked about before and last week, way better than statistics and things like that. People want to know about actual people and actual lives being changed more than just numbers.
Yep. So tell a story of what God is doing. Even just one will go a long way. Number 4, speak well of what God is already doing in the community. So we talked about this last episode of the opposite of like how different we're going to be. God's already doing stuff. You you also don't know what all God is doing, even if it's this really small town. You don't know all the people, and so these whole things of like we're gonna do these things that no church is gonna be like us. You have no idea. So speak well of what God is already doing, saying things like we want to join in what God's already doing here, even including other churches and pastors you have talked to is helpful and it gives you legitimacy, especially when you're talking to your own people or to other people. It just makes it shows that it's not a competition, that you're not trying to steal people or you're not scared. Like for a new city, we genuinely would just want people to be connected anywhere. In fact, we had a new guy who came a couple weeks ago. His family's moving here, and he came and he was telling me what he was looking for or whatever. And I was like, hey, there's a lot of other great churches, and if you need help finding anyone, let me know. He sent me an email this morning, even though he's like 5 minutes from us. He's like, can you tell me some about those other churches? And so I recommended 3 churches that are in our area, that are bigger than our church and maybe be able to offer what he wants that we can't. And it's like unfortunate, but at the end of the day, what we want more than anything else is people connected in community so that they can walk with Jesus. It doesn't have to be New City. And so, speaking well of what God is already doing, I just, I don't know. I think it will do better for you, even like selfishly, even if you have the wrong motives, because it shows like,
Yeah.
hey, we're not just about us. And so, I think the more you can do that, the better.
Yeah, and there's no city that's going to be 100% transformed by one church. That's just not how it really works, especially in the U.S. And so, partnering with church, like no matter where you're planting, there are churches there that are doing something good. There may be less than in some other areas, but there's always going to be another church that's doing something right. And you don't need to act like there's not. It's like you're not in competition with them. You're not, hopefully you're not like literally next door neighbors, but like you're probably far enough away from them that you're perfectly fine. And there's no need to act like we're doing something that the other churches aren't, or that there's a problem here that we're going to solve because these other churches are failing, because that's just not true. And I don't think most people think that's true, but it can come across that way in how we communicate it. But I think one of the most beneficial thing you can do for your people is to, from day one, speak positively about other churches in your area. And even, and that means like if you have negative experience at a church in your area, that means not really talking about that, especially to your people, like, and just not bringing that church up if that's what it takes. But find opportunities to actually like point out what other churches are doing by name, not just like there's a lot of great churches in the area, but don't ask me about them. Like actually like say this is a great church in the area. And we've had multiple times where someone was, for whatever reason, decided to leave New City or visited, and this wasn't the place for them, and where we said like, I'll help you find a church. Yep. And sometimes they take us up on it, like you're saying, sometimes they don't. But I think it really speaks volumes to how you view everyone else in the city, and you're not thinking that you're just there to solve the problem yourself.
And I'm a pastor, so if I'm meeting with a church planner and they were to literally say, hey, guys, doing a lot of cool things in this area, and we just want to join in. And I'm like, yeah, because he is doing cool things at our church. Our church is not massive, but there's things that are happening here. There's things that are happening in other churches. And so it just shows a humility and awareness of that. So speak well of what God is already doing. It's a definitely underrated church planting tactic.
Yep, absolutely.
It seems weird, especially if you've got a launch team and you're like, we're trying to grow this thing so that we can actually plant to talk well. But it just gets everyone in the right perspective to know that you're all on the same team. It's really helpful.
Yep.
Number 5, have a network or denomination on board or some sort of oversight that includes other churches.
Yeah.
Because that just gives legitimacy to what you're doing, even if the average person in your church plant has no idea. So like we're non-denominational, but we're part of Acts 29. The average person has no idea what Acts 29 is.
Right.
And it's one of the larger networks.
Mm-hmm.
You might be listening to this and maybe have heard of Acts 29, or maybe not, have no idea what Acts 29 is. Mm-hmm. It's not about like explaining, you can if you want, when it's appropriate, explaining all the things about your network or denomination, but it shows people, hey, we've got people that have spoken into this, that are providing accountability, that have said like this is a thing that's worth supporting. Mm-hmm. The biggest reason that I have found that planters don't want to do this is because it slows them down. They really want to plant a church now, and then it just doesn't work well. Planting by yourself, it will never work well. Yeah. And so I'm not just talking about like personally for your church, but I'm also talking about if you're trying to raise money, if you're trying to include people on your team, to be able to say, we've got other pastors or other churches or other ministries who are, behind what we're doing. It gives you some credibility of like, you're not just some random person. And it also kind of fights the whole, even if that's not your intent, we're starting a new church because we're trying to do something bigger or better than someone else. It's like, no, we're not. We're trying to join what God's already doing. And so we've got other churches that are also excited about what we're doing here. And so having a network or denomination on board, it's not just good for you personally, but it's also good as you meet and talk with other people, because it makes what you're doing is actually legit, not like I wanted to do this, but nobody thinks this is a good idea.
And none of us have all the answers to plant a church. Like we don't, and nobody does. And so it helps to have someone that you can at least somewhat collaborate with, get some training from, or ideas from, or bounce idea, whatever. And so just trying to do it completely by yourself, I think, is really a really big hindrance, especially, I think for everybody, but especially if you're a younger church planter. Like if you're in your 20s and I were to go to something and you were to say, we're not hooked up with any denomination, we're not hooked up with any network, we're not hooked up with anything, and and not pursuing that, I would really question why. And not saying like I would walk out the door, but I would really be curious what the reason is, because whether it's denomination or network, there is one for every single theological leaning that exists. And so it's not a matter of, we don't line up with these people, because there are other people that you do line up with. And so there's just, there's just not a big reason not to. I don't know. I feel I have a hard time kind of explaining further. I don't see a big reason not to. If you have a big reason, maybe you can email us and tell us why we're wrong. But I don't see a reason not to pursue that.
Yep. Yeah, having a network denomination outside support on board is super underrated and is really important for you and for the people you're inviting in.
Yep.
And then last but not least, I just have it this way. Tell me what your family thinks. And I mean, this is like if I'm meeting with a church planter, so I'm not like just like the average person because I'm in ministry, but even I think this is helpful if you're inviting people on your team. But particularly when you're like, I want to know what does your spouse think about this? What does your wife think? What does your kids think? Like, are they excited? I mean, they can be anxious and nervous. That's totally fine. And if they're not, you're probably lying anyway.
Yeah.
But like, do they support what's going on here? Or are they like doing this because they just want to be supportive and it's the right thing, but they don't think it's a good idea? Like, I genuinely want to know. One of the things, being able to help with the assessments with Acts 29, like, it's just very obvious that and I know this is my own story as well, but if this pastor who wants to plant a church and his wife is like not on board for whatever reason, sometimes very good reasons, maybe she's got concerns with him, or concerns for their family. It just isn't. It does not work because ministry is really hard. It's hard enough on its own, and you and your spouse will go through hard seasons. But if you're not like, this is something we really want to do and feel led to do, it's going to be really hard to stick in it. And so I'm just curious what your family thinks. And so even if it's not necessarily asked, I think it's helpful to be proactive in talking about our plans, like also our family plans, like what they think, what my spouse thinks, what my kids think. I mean, they might be too young to know what's going on.
Right.
But yeah, like I want to know what they think. And they can be nervous. They can be scared. That's totally fine. But are they in and are they supportive of what's happening or are they not?
And especially when you're meeting with a pastor, obviously there's certain things I think that are probably a little bit more appropriate to communicate when you're talking to another pastor versus someone to join your launch team. But if your spouse is having, it's not even like second thoughts or wanting to back out, but if they're nervous about something, communicate that with somebody. Yeah. And that's not saying like, oh, well, this is gonna, or they're not in, and so we got to figure out a way to change this, or we're gonna fail because of this. But like, your spouse, I'll put it, your spouse does in the majority of cases have some sort of concerns. Yeah. They may be with you. They may be worries about financial concerns. They may be, minor. They may be major, but they probably have some. Maybe they've communicated them. Maybe they haven't. But to just act like no one has any concern. This is gonna be great. Everyone's on board. Who cares if I, can support the family or not because we haven't raised any money yet. That's just not realistic. And so communicate those things, and not in a doom and gloom way or a depressive way if that's not the case, but like just communicate the reality of what's going on, because we've all understand. And if you were to come and just say like, it's just everything is great, this has never caused any, there's no issue whatsoever, and everyone's just 100% on board, and everything's wonderful, even though we're struggling to raise money, and no one's ever had any second thoughts. I don't know. Maybe you're telling the truth, but I would question it a little bit. So just be honest with what your family thinks, and obviously, hopefully, they are supportive, and they probably are, and communicate that as well, that they're excited about it too, because you're not planting alone. This isn't just a you thing; it's your whole family's doing it. So just bring them into the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, and that's also just as a side note, just a big red flag if the family's not on the same page to figure out what that looks like. Yep. So. Yeah, tell me what your family thinks is really important. And again, being nervous, having questions, or even having doubts is fine. But are they bought in and excited about this, or do they feel like they're being dragged into this because it's the right thing to do? That's a big difference.
And I think also being honest about some of those, like more, not saying like one spouse does not want to do it and one does, but like some of those more minor concerns. Dylan. I just completely lost my train of thought. I think being honest about them, I think will help.
Did you find your train of thought?
I'm going down the track.
Minor concerns.
We'll see.
Minor
if we land
concerns
there.
Can still be major concerns.
No, I think that I don't know. It just helps the church planner that you're talking to see that you're a little more serious about it. Yeah. That was not at all the point I was going to make. But
well, when you said my name, I thought you thought I had epiphany. I was really excited to hear it.
Nope, I was just letting you in on the hole I dug myself into and see if you could dig me out.
Well, what your family thinks matters. So also make sure you're talking to your family as well, because again, you could be led and your spouse could be excited about it, but if you don't have a financial plan, I mean, that's a legitimate thing to be nervous about.
Yeah.
If you don't have healthy work boundaries so that you're actually going to be home with your family, that's a legitimate thing to be nervous about. Even if you're like a high character person who loves Jesus, there are various things that are important. So
yeah.
So those are 6 underrated church planting tactics to do. We think those are really helpful. If you emphasize those, I think that will go well for you. Again, practicalplanting.com/launch is our launch team course. and we talk about practically how to do some of these things if you're interested, like defining a timeline and why to plant a church and all these sort of things, and why they're helpful. So check that out. Also, if you're on Facebook, the Practical Church Planting Facebook group, you can search us and join us there. And we'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.